She thought he was just another customer, but she had no idea how wrong she was. The anger inside her had been simmering all morning, and when the hot coffee splashed across him, her world would never be the same again. It was the height of the breakfast rush at Ellie's Diner in Louisville, Kentucky. The chatter of busy diners blended with the clatter of plates, the hiss of the coffee machine, and the constant hum of a chaotic, bustling kitchen. The air was thick with the energy of 100 small movements, all happening at once. Jenna, a 25-year-old waitress, darted through the maze of tables, her ponytail bouncing with each hurried step, struggling to stay intact. She was exhausted, her shift had started at dawn, and the sting of yet another rude customer was still fresh in her mind. With a frustrated sigh, she slammed a tray onto the counter. Another day, another rude idiot, she muttered under her breath, while the cook slid another plate of pancakes her way. Table 7, he grunted, not even looking up, his voice low and impatient. Jenna rolled her eyes, grabbing the plate. At table 3, a man in his mid-40s sat, sipping water and studying the menu, his eyes scanning each item as if searching for something specific. He wore a neat, pressed suit that hinted at his professionalism. His posture was poised, but there was something about the way he held himself that demanded attention, an aura of quiet authority. His name was Robert. To the staff, he was just another customer, though there was something different about him, a calmness, a stillness that made him stand out. When Jenna approached, he smiled politely and placed his order, scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee. She returned a few minutes later with the food, dropping the plate onto the table with an almost careless force. Robert glanced down, his eyes narrowing slightly. He noticed the mistake right away, the eggs were fried, not scrambled. With a measured calm, he raised his hand. "Excuse me, I believe there's been a mistake. I asked for scrambled eggs." Jenna froze, the tension in her chest building instantly. The weight of her entire shift was crashing down on her. The room was still alive with chatter, but it felt like all eyes were suddenly on her. Her face burned with frustration, but she forced a tight smile. "I'll fix it," she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. She turned, but each step felt heavier than the last. Fixing it meant more work meant more time in this place she hated. She clenched her teeth, her hands gripping the plate harder than she realized. But something else was bubbling beneath the surface, something more dangerous than just irritation. Jenna stormed into the kitchen, slamming the plate down onto the counter. "Scrambled eggs for table 3, she barked, her voice sharper than she intended. The cook didn't flinch, raising an eyebrow but continuing to crack fresh eggs into the sizzling pan. Jenna crossed her arms and began tapping her foot, the rhythmic noise grating against the hum of the kitchen. Her mind was a whirlwind, frustration building with every passing second. The last table had left a terrible tip, and her double shift stretched on with no end in sight. Rent was due, her car was in desperate need of repairs, and her phone bill hung over her like an ever-looming storm. She caught a glimpse of Robert through the order window. He was sitting there, calm as ever, reading something on his phone. How could he be so relaxed while she was drowning in chaos? The sight of him, so serene, made her stomach churn. How could someone sit there so composed when she was breaking her back in this place? The cook slid the new plate of eggs onto the counter. Jenna snatched it up with a forced smile and returned to Robert's table. "Here are your scrambled eggs," she said, the words clipped, colder than she intended. Robert looked up, his expression still warm. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, calm, and kind. But Jenna couldn't respond. She turned sharply and walked away, the frustration bubbling up inside her again. It wasn't just about the eggs or the mistakes, it was everything. The bad tips, the rude customers, the endless hours. It all crushed her spirit. A moment later, Robert raised his hand again. Jenna hesitated. She didn't want to turn around. The heat of his gaze pressed against her back, making her skin crawl. But she had no choice. She approached slowly, already bracing for the worst. "I hate to bother you again," Robert said, his voice polite, "but the coffee is lukewarm. Could I get a fresh cup?" Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't the request, it was everything else. The way her life felt like it was spiraling out of control, and Robert's calm demeanor seemed to mock it all. His polite tone pushed her to the edge. The grip on the coffee pot tightened, her knuckles turning white. She leaned in, trying to keep her cool, but the room around her began to blur. What happened next was nothing short of a breaking point. Jenna stood there, shaking with every ounce of frustration that had built up all morning. The coffee pot felt like a weight in her hands. Her mind screamed for her to stop, but the fury inside her surged uncontrollably. Before she could think, before she could pull herself back, she tilted the pot forward. The steaming coffee splashed across the table, splattering onto Robert's face. The room went silent. The clatter of dishes stopped. The conversations died down. All eyes were on her. Robert recoiled, his hand flying to his face, but the damage was done. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up, his composure slipping for the first time. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and controlled, though there was no hiding the anger in his words. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded. Jenna froze. The coffee pot was still in her hand, her whole body stiff with shock. Her breath caught in her throat as the reality of what she had just done hit her like a ton of bricks. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Customers murmured. A few gasps echoed through the diner. The manager, Carl, rushed over, his face pale with a mix of anger and panic. "Jenna! What did you do?" he barked, snatching the coffee pot from her trembling hands. Robert stood tall, his suit stained with coffee, but his expression unreadable. He wiped his face with a napkin, and for a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice that was low but carried an undeniable authority, Robert said, "You clearly don't know who I am." Jenna's stomach dropped. There was something in his tone, a calm, commanding edge, that made her knees feel weak. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was stare at the man she had just humiliated. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The weight of the moment pressed down on every single person in the room. And then Robert spoke again. He straightened his tie, his eyes fixed on Jenna, his voice steady but sharp. "I own this restaurant," he said, the words cutting through the thick silence like a knife. Jenna's knees buckled, and she almost collapsed. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You, what?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Robert Gaines," he said, gesturing to the diner around them, his tone unwavering. "The one who signs your paycheck. The one who keeps the lights on in this place. And the one you just poured coffee on." Gasps rippled through the room. Eyes went wide. The other waitstaff stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Carl looked like he might collapse under the weight of the revelation. Jenna's mouth hung open, but no sound escaped. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, colliding into one overwhelming realization: she had just poured coffee on her boss. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt every single mistake she had made that morning, every frustration she had let fester, crash down on her at once. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Robert raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice soft but firm. Jenna felt like the ground should swallow her whole. The weight of her mistake was unbearable, crushing her chest with every passing second. But Robert wasn't finished. His gaze shifted toward Carl, his face an unreadable mask, and with chilling calm, he instructed, "Get her out of here." Carl hesitated, his face paling at the severity of the request. "Robert, maybe we should—" "No," Robert's voice was firm, cutting off the words before they could fully form. "Get her out." Carl nodded, motioning for Jenna to follow him, her legs weak, like jelly, as she stumbled toward the back. The murmurs from the room buzzed in her ears, but none of them were for her, not yet. She could feel every eye in the diner burning into her, the judgment sharp as she passed. She felt exposed, humiliated. Once in the break room, Jenna collapsed onto the cramped bench, her hands burying her face in them, her body shaking. Carl lingered by the door, unsure of what to do, his own discomfort thickening the air between them. The muffled sounds of clinking dishes and distant chatter from the diner seemed to mock her in her isolation. She could almost hear them talking about her, even if she wasn't there. Carl began, but his voice faltered, the words not coming. He let out a heavy sigh. "You messed up bad." The tears came without warning, rolling down Jenna's face in quick streams. She struggled to choke out a few words between sobs. "I didn't mean to, I lost it." Carl shook his head, his tone flat. "That doesn't matter now. You poured hot coffee on the owner of the diner. I don't know how you come back from that." Meanwhile, out in the dining room, Robert stood by the counter, dabbing at his shirt with a damp towel, his face hard, jaw tight. The staff hovered nearby, casting furtive glances his way, some with concern, others with fear. The customers were less discreet, whispers erupted around the room, some reaching for their phones to capture the aftermath. One of the older waitresses, Denise, approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning his face for signs of injury. "I'm fine," Robert said, his voice cold, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his true feelings. He didn't want to talk about the pain, he was too busy processing the overwhelming weight of the situation. He had worked tirelessly to build this diner, not just a business, but a community, a safe space for everyone. And yet, here he was, standing in the aftermath of something that cut deeper than any mistake he'd encountered before. It wasn't just about the spilled coffee, it was about something more. A lack of respect. An act of carelessness. A woman who had let her frustrations control her without thinking of the consequences. Robert's mind raced as he processed it all. His composure, his calm exterior, it wasn't a mask to hide weakness. It was the foundation of something far deeper. But what now? He had a choice to make. A choice that would impact more than just Jenna's future, it would shape the example he set for everyone in the room. He stood still for a moment, eyes sweeping across the diner. The staff, the customers, everyone was waiting for his next move. The silence felt heavy, suffocating. But his principles were louder than any expectation placed on him. He moved toward the center of the room, his voice cutting through the quiet, clear and deliberate. "Accidents happen," Robert began, his tone holding a gravity that stilled the murmurs, but what happened today wasn't an accident. It was a choice. A bad one, driven by frustration and carelessness. The room was silent, each word hanging in the air, heavy and deliberate, like stones dropped into a still pond. Robert turned to Carl, who still stood near the break room door, his posture stiff with unease. "Bring her back out here," Robert said, his voice unwavering. Carl hesitated, clearly torn. "Are you sure she?" "I'm sure." Robert's interruption was final. Moments later, Jenna emerged, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking. She couldn't meet his eyes, but she could feel his gaze on her, weighing her down. She stood there, vulnerable, exposed, in front of the entire diner. "Jenna," Robert said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding, "what you did was unacceptable. But this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. About how we treat people when we think no one's looking. About the assumptions we make, and the anger we let control us." Jenna's voice was barely audible as she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. I let everything get to me, and I don't know how to fix it." Robert studied her for a long moment. His face unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke, the words heavy with their weight. "You fix it by taking responsibility. By learning from it. By doing better." Her heart lurched. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Are you firing me?" He paused, letting the question sink in. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Then he spoke again. "No. Not yet. But you're on probation. You've got the next month to prove to me, to yourself, and to everyone here that you're better than this." The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, others in understanding. Jenna's tears continued to flow, a mix of relief and shame overtaking her. "I will," she promised, her voice strong despite the tremble in it. "I'll do whatever it takes." Robert nodded, then turned to the rest of the diner, his voice carrying clearly. "This is a reminder to all of us. We don't know what someone else is going through. But that's no excuse to lash out. Respect isn't optional. It's the bare minimum." The room remained silent, not from shock, but from a deeper reflection. Robert's words lingered, planting seeds in the minds of everyone present. He turned back to Jenna, his voice gentler now, yet still firm. "Now, go clean yourself up and then get back to work. We're not done here." Jenna's footsteps were slow as she moved to the restroom, splashing cold water on her face. The coolness didn't fully wipe away the shame, but it steadied her nerves. She took a deep breath, staring at her reflection, her tear-streaked face a painful reminder of her mistake. But Robert's words echoed in her mind. "You fix it by taking responsibility." Out in the diner, the staff began to move again, cautiously at first, returning to their tasks. The customers continued their meals, though the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about what had just happened, what they had witnessed. When Jenna returned to the floor, she moved more deliberately now. Approaching Robert, her voice soft, but steady, she said, "Thank you for giving me a second chance. I won't waste it." Robert glanced up, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, he nodded. "Good. Now get back to work, and remember, every interaction matters." The rest of the day passed with a renewed sense of purpose. Jenna worked harder than ever, not out of fear, but out of determination. The staff rallied behind her, and the customers seemed more patient, more understanding. For the first time in a long time, the diner felt like a true community. Sometimes, a single moment reveals the cracks in our character. But it can also offer the chance to rebuild, stronger, more compassionate than before. Respect is a choice, and its ripple effect can change lives.